Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. It is December 2018. This episode will focus on a review of J. Dyer's fantastic book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film. This book was published in 2016 and is 370 pages long, but it is a very brisk read, especially if you're a film lover or cinephile, as I am and as Jay obviously is as well. I will link all of the relevant material below so that you can purchase this book yourself and so that you can find Jay's website, which I believe is back up and functional. He was taken down shortly after Alex Jones was zapped out and placed into the electronic gulags, which is probably the ultimate plan that the leftist establishment has for everyone right now. I just got through with a 4-part series where I was documenting the ways in which they are mapping out the IDW or Intellectual Dark Web and also the AIN or Alternative Influencer Network. And all of these people are being mapped out for the specific purpose that they are going to be targeted for takedowns at some later point. I pointed out in that series the ways in which they will lump together mainstream conservatives, they will lump together Christians, libertarians, anyone else who is opposed to the left right now, and essentially insinuate that these people are either white nationalists or white supremacists or something like that, so that people will just be dismissive of it if the attacks come later on. Now, admittedly, for this episode, it's going to be a rather unusual or unorthodox review. I'm going to extensively look into the book itself. Jay has actually given me permission to read rather extensively from it in order to do so. But if people are here just for sort of the Spaceballs version of the short version of my review, I would say that I don't really give 4-star reviews or 5-star reviews or, a scale of 1 to 10 or anything like that. I just straight thumbs up or thumbs down. This one is absolutely 2 thumbs up, must read. If you have your own personal library, you absolutely want this to be in your library, but you don't want it to just be sitting there. You have to get this and read it cover to cover. And speaking of the cover, he has one of the most iconic images in all of film history, right there in the center, as he shows a scene from Eyes Wide Shut where the ritual had been taking place. And this is the scene where Tom Cruise's character has been forced to basically reveal himself, to unconceal himself. And this really gets to the core of this entire book, which is all about the exoteric and esoteric divide that film has. The sort of separation between the sacred and the profane, the way that film speaks to us as a particular type of iconographic medium that is saying to us one story for the profane, that would be us, the outsiders, the so-called know-nothings or whatever, the hoi polloi, and then there's a whole different message for those who are in the know, those who are of the esoteric version of interpretation. Now, from here on out, the rest of this, I would say, is a spoiler alert. You can get on out if you don't want to know anything else about what is inside of the book. But I'm going to begin here with a few quotations from page 257 in his analysis of 1971's actually quite a good film, Diamonds Are Forever. So at the top of the page, he talks about here how the quote he is about to go into is actually from Ian Fleming's 1958 novel, Dr. No. And it says here, the doctor makes an equally prescient and insightful statement about black market operations and their fierce master, shadow government. Quote, Mr. Bond, power is sovereignty. Clausewitz's first principle was to have a secure base. Now, Clausewitz, for those who don't know, is a military theoretician and strategist, one of the greatest of all time. Probably second only, perhaps, to Sun Tzu. And actually, I hope to be doing a reading pretty soon of Sun Tzu's Art of War and have the entire thing up maybe this month, possibly. But I continue. From there, one proceeds to freedom of action. Together, that is sovereignty. I have secured these things and much beside. No one else in the world possesses them in the same degree. They cannot have them. The world is too public. These things can only be secured in privacy. You talk of kings and presidents. How much power do they possess? As much as their people will allow them. Who in the world has the power of life and death over his people? Now that Stalin is dead, can you name any man except myself? And how do I possess that power, that sovereignty? Through privacy, through the fact that nobody knows. End quote. And then later down on the same page, this is Jay's take on things which I find to be largely accurate. He says, In reality, the hierarchical pyramid of global government is not a series of goodly nation-states seeking to protect the free world from dastardly Manichaean dialectical manifestations, but rather is itself a large, interlocking system of crime syndicates. The world government that presently exists is one of covert, hidden rulership by various oligarchs. While a certain level of competition is tolerated, these oligarchical Dr. No's are not the denizens of secret Soviet underground layers, but Bilderberg attendees and banking magnates. And the great thing about this book is Jay doesn't just make these as sort of bald assertions. He actually backs it up with historical material. I think that his educational background is very similar to my own in both history and philosophy. And he goes on to quote here Dr. Carroll Quigley's rather infamous and, as he calls it, a classic Tragedy and Hope that basically sums up the exact same position that he's laid out here that relates to this Dr. No type character, that there's a series of these people who are basically all over the world and running things towards disaster, more or less. And another good representative sample is found on page 73 in his review of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining from 1980. He says here, Jack's experience is similar to Bill Harford's in Eyes Wide Shut, while they are of course very different characters. Like the Indian burial ground upon which the hotel is built, it becomes a site of ritual chant and ritual enactment as Wendy's flight from Jack features background music of Native American chanting. Of course, this brings to mind Poltergeist as well. The sacrifice is the climax of the film in the liturgy, where the release of the blood will satiate the powers of darkness. Like the mazes of M.C. Escher, a strange loop of eternal return. And this is a common theme that emerges in film. You'll see over and over and over, and in the books that these sorts of people write. It's about this myth of the eternal return. Will be the punishment Jack concocts for himself in his psychical prison for failing to complete his task as ordered by Grady. Frozen like the damned souls of traitors near Satan in Dante's Inferno, it is worth noting that Dante also made reference to the Minotaur, which relates well to the obligations Grady places upon the beast, Jack. And of course, Jack Nicholson does have this look, on his face of a Minotaur, of a sort of beast-like character. And the reference to the labyrinth would be the large tree maze that is on the grounds of the Overlook Hotel. I actually just rewatched The Shining recently. It's one of those films it's just so good. I'll watch it maybe once per year. I have a certain rewatch list of movies that I always go back to, like in the winter when it's cold and nasty outside. I like to watch The Thing by John Carpenter. But we move down here. It says, The Shining then is a ghost story, but also something much deeper in Kubrick's film. And that's one of the things that upset Stephen King about it, is he wanted to keep it just as this sort of ghost story, but Kubrick wanted to add in all of these other elements that he knew about from his own experiences with these Hollywood elite scumbags. It says here, it is a multi-layered exploration of the psyche, the spiritual realm, surrealism, ancient mythology, and the satanic occult elite that rule the West. As the theme of pedophilic generational bloodlines parasitically manipulate the underclass through the false promise of worldly prosperity. And I wrote out here to the side of it because I heavily annotate my books, actually inside the books. This inherently brings about decadence and stupidity, which is why the left also uses late-night comedy talk shows like Saturday Night Live and others as their primary vehicles in order to speak to one another outside of the toxic universities that are also very much under their control. And that, too, is one of the points that Jay is trying to make throughout his analysis of these various films, is not only are they speaking to us in a particular manner, and of course at a subconscious level they're speaking to us, but also this is one of the ways in which they relate their stories to one another for those who are sort of quote-unquote in the know. So I'd like to move from there to the table of contents just to give you sort of an overview of the sorts of films that he will be covering. So it says here in Part 1, Hollywood, Babylon, and Kubrick. Chapter 1, The Occult Empire. Chapter 2, An Esoteric Analysis of Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut, 1999. Chapter 3, Kubrick Bears the Light, The Shining, 1980. Chapter 4, 2001, An Alchemical Spatial Odyssey, 1968. In Section 2, Spielberg's Android Space Brothers. Chapter 5, H.G. Wells' Science Fiction Propaganda and Spielberg's Mythos. And one of the really cool things about this book is how he's able to tie all this in, all the way from the writings that these people were producing in the late 19th century all throughout the 20th century, and how so much of this early science fiction stuff blended over into the films, but then they also carry on these same themes, these themes that are related to evolutionary theory, to materialism. Basically, that would be in terms of their metaphysics, because there are certain implications that almost directly follow if your metaphysical assumptions are those of materialism and mechanism. Chapter 6, E.T., the Extraterrestrial and Esoteric Analysis, 1982. Chapter 7, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, 1977. Chapter 8, AI, Artificial Intelligence, 2001. Transhumanist Fairy Tale, and that's what so much of this is all about, is artificial intelligence, transhumanism, humans being blended with, basically becoming cyborg-type characters. Chapter 9, Minority Report, 2002, Esoteric Analysis. In Part 3, he has 70s and 80s fantasy dystopia. Chapter 10, Logan's Run, 1976, Our Technocratic Dystopia Unveiled. Chapter 11, Illuminist Symbolism, in the 1974 film Zardoz, and boy, that one is a doozy. If you've ever seen Zardoz, it's very, very strange. Chapter 12, Labyrinth, 1986, Journey into Sarah's Subconsciousness, or Subconscious. Chapter 13, The Never-Ending Story, 1984, Esoteric Analysis, and a lot of the movies he has in here are films that, my wife and I watch usually once a year. Chapter 14, Alchemy and Eros in Ridley Scott's Legend, 1985. Chapter 15, Blade Runner, 1982, The Synthetic Future Revealed. And of course, that draws so much on the work of Philip K. Dick, who had some extraordinarily strange views of the world. And not all of it was entirely induced by his drug use, but I think a goodly deal of it was. Chapter 16, Prometheus, 2012, Esoteric Analysis. Part 4, 007 and Hitchcock. Chapter 17, Deep State Actors in Diamonds Are Forever, 1971. Chapter 18, Moonraker, 1979, and The Breakaway Civilization. I've mentioned that concept before when I was covering the 4 conspiracy documents. I'll link that series below if you want to hear about that one. Chapter 19, Bond Rebooted. That would be Casino Royale. Very good film. Chapter 20, Occult MI6, Dennis Wheatley and The Devil Rides Out. Chapter 21, Hollywood Spies, North by Northwest, 1959. Chapter 22, Vertigo, 1958. Chapter 23, Inside David Lynch, An Esoteric Guide to Twin Peaks, 1990 to 92. And hopefully in the next book, maybe he covers the revamp of it on Showtime. Chapter 24, Occult Brainwashing in Lynch's Mulholland Drive, 2001. Conclusion, The CIA and Hollywood, A Dark Marriage. So before I jump into his introduction here, which is just filled with so many fantastic sentences and paragraphs, I mean, it's just great how he sums up everything here. It's titled Film as Ritual. And it's it gets into talking about the iconographic archetypes and how Hollywood speaks to us. He doesn't simply do what you see from so many film reviewers who talk about tropes and tropology. That, well, here's this way that this plays out in this film, and then you see that repeated in other TV shows and all of this. Another thing that he goes back to over and over is he points out the way that Western or Christian conceptions of time are very different than what you see portrayed very often in the Hollywood films, which always try to get into these concept of cyclical time, that time is repetition of sorts, or time or history rhymes, rather than directly repeats itself. Because one of the things about the Christian conception of time, it's linear time, and that really raises the stakes for all of us in existence now. It's not like some kind of a thing that you're going to be trapped in or that you get to repeat over and over again. You actually have a beginning and an end point to things. So he opens here with a quote from Robert Johnston's Real Spirituality, Theology in Film and Dialogue. Genres are a form of contemporary myth, giving expression to the meaning of everyday life. Genres carry an intrinsic worldview. They become stylized conventions to portray universal conflicts whereby viewers can participate ritualistically in the basic beliefs, fears, and anxieties not only of their age but of all ages. As Orson Welles, an absolutely brilliant man himself, once remarked, quote, The camera is much more than a recording apparatus. It is a medium via which messages reach us from another world that is not ours, that brings us to the heart of a great secret. Here magic begins, end quote. Genre films become iconic. That is, through repetition, a certain imagery, storyline, and characterization become archetypal. And my commentary on this would be, what is doubly dangerous about all of this, about this entire concept, is who gets to represent the world through film. And if you look into who they are, they're almost all secularists, leftists, atheists, and we already know this too, a good number of occultists, rapists, and pedophiles are the ones who are representing the world to us through film and in television as well. Jay begins here. Everyone loves the movies. We've grown up immersed in the Hollywood mythos, whether we wanted to or not. We swim in a veritable aether of perpetual celluloid synthetica, churned out in mass cookie-cutter fashion and beamed into every corner of our life. And while I bash it and critique it, fashioning myself a critic of a different sort, I simultaneously love film. And I'm sure you probably do too. Absolutely, no question about it. And, considering all of this symbolism, man, they have really ramped it up lately in the amount of occult symbology that they're cramming into film and television shows. Like if you watch the most recent season of American Horror Story about the Antichrist's emergence, I mean, that show is so filled with occult symbolism. And the wild thing about it is whoever it is actually knows the occult very well, because they get so much of the symbology correct, at least in terms of the way that it was represented throughout the medieval period and the Renaissance. And the same thing for Netflix's new show, the Sabrina the Teenage Witch. The remake of that is just completely dripping with all of this rather vile occult symbolism and whatnot. And that's one of the weird things about reading Jay's book, is there's so many of these movies in here that he covers that I absolutely just have loved over the years. But then, you see how they've encoded all of these dark messages inside of it. And it's just, it really just kind of boggles your mind. You're like, I love it, but oh my goodness, I can't believe they had all this stuff in it, Here too, I'd also like to point out there's some other interesting books out there that take different approaches to analyzing film. One from a postmodernist approach, which I used to be into, but actually they're still pretty good books. It's called Alien Zone 1 and Alien Zone 2, and they do a really good job of analyzing science fiction films in a very unusual manner that I also find interesting, perhaps, but not so much the way that I would guide my life or anything like that. Jay continues here, this book represents my own attempt to decode and interpret the images and symbols that scroll across these all-pervasive screens that dominate our daily lives. It seems as if screens are now the paradigmatic lenses by which we reflect, interpret, and reinterpret the external world, as well as ourselves, and supply our existence with the ruling archetypes of hidden control, a chaotic narrative both sacred and profane. And of course, this reminds me of Netflix's Black Mirror. That's one of the points that they're trying to make with that show, is that we imbue so much power inside of the little black lens that we all gaze into. The discipline of semiotics is the philosophy of interpretation of signs and symbols. So what the reader can expect in this work is my own attempt to decipher what enters our mass mind, or more properly, the collective unconscious, semiotics of mass media. And this is good here that he's being very upfront about what he's doing. It's actually a sort of hermeneutics of film that he's introducing you to. From there, I'm going to skip over to page 4 and read another really good section here where he mentions an author who many people have not heard of, but really jumped out to me when he got to this point because I've read some of this person's works as well. This book does not represent another Hollywood scandal rag, as the focus of my analysis and investigations do not center around who had sex with who or what star was whacked. Rather, we will think in terms of metaphysics and the esoteric, looking at what Michael A. Hoffman accurately called twilight language. We will investigate patterns, images, as well as religious, political, and historical connections between the films chosen and so-called reality. If you happen to be wondering what twilight language is, it will be explained in this book. I skip down here and he says, my thesis is that film and our mass attendance at theaters is fundamentally religious in character. It is a ritual process at work. And one of the important concepts, too, that Michael A. Hoffman talks about in his books that is also related to this Twilight language concept is the alchemical revelation of the method, which I mentioned to you before when I was covering the conspiracy documents. There's this certain belief that among the conspirators' hierarchy, or whatever it is you wish to call them, the Illuminati, the New World Order, the, Bilderberg Group people, all this kind of stuff, the cryptocracy and so on, is that they sort of have this internal narrative or whatever that drives them to basically tell the world what their plan for them is, the things that they eventually hope to bring about against us. Over on page 5, I'm going to quote another section here, but just for those who don't know, Jay is an Orthodox Christian, and he is a rather strong critic of modernity and postmodernity. I too agree with him and have many, many problems with both modernity and postmodernity, as I've mentioned on the show many times before. But he goes through a quote here from Mircea Eliade's book, The Sacred and the Profane, and he says here, Eliade is invoking the primal urge in man to consecrate a sacred space, a space where the gods of old come to communicate meaning, morality, and telos to mankind, whereupon the high places, the heavenly realm of celestial intelligences, might make a theophanic manifestation to shape earth in the form of the above, imposing order upon unruly chaos. Yet modern man is no longer superstitious, we are told, and with the dawn of the age of reason, he abandoned ritual and liturgy for the reasonably rational life of being an informed citizen of his enlightened democratic republic, intimately involved in forming and shaping his local social contracted propositional government covenant. And here he is critiquing Thomas Hobbes' concept of the social contract, which is a theory that I completely repudiate and totally disagree with. There is no such thing as a social contract. None of us have agreed to it. None of us have actually signed any such thing. There is no social contract. It's a complete myth. And then the idea here that the United States is a propositional government, that too comes in for critique, as it well should. And I think really the overall point to the whole thing is this is the fundamental flaw with atheism, is that they have nothing that is special, nothing that is sacred. Everything is the profane for them. And really, they have no fundamental or foundational organizing principles. People simply do things, unless you go along with, say, the evolutionary psychology crowd, and then they say, well, everything at base is all about reproduction, but that's merely base and shallow, and people really want something more than that, because they either turn to that or they turn to nihilism, and they think that everything is simply meaningless and purposeless. But another one of the messages that I think that Jay is frequently driving at in this, and that I also personally happen to believe, is that many of these people simply keep their atheism or their secularism as their sort of outer shroud. It is the exoteric layer, but really the esoteric is that many of these people are actually occultists, they're Luciferians, they're Satanists, or however else you wish to characterize that. I know some people want to, have this sort of apologetics for Satanism lately. But these people are definitely into something that is dark and malevolent. However you wish to characterize that, I think that would be the internal layer that is far more important than their external so-called, belief in atheism. One of the other really great and interesting things about this book, too, is the way that he has all of these informational inserts placed into various places throughout the book, where he'll give biographical information of a person who's mentioned in the body of the text, and then he'll tell, basically who they were, some of the other things that they did in their life, so that you have a little better context for the person who's being discussed in those particular sections. Over on page 6, we have another section here that I would like to quote, where he says, Fleming's imagery recalls a real-world example mentioned in Victor Marchetti's classic The CIA and the Cult of Intelligence, which describes a scenario of manipulation in the Philippines. Quote, when I introduced the practical joke aspect of Psy-War to the Philippine Army, it stimulated some imaginative operations that were remarkably effective. One Psy-War operation played upon the popular dread of an aswang, or vampire. When a hook patrol came along the trail, the ambushers silently snatched the last man of the patrol. They punctured his neck with 2 holes, vampire fashion, held the body up by the heels, drained it of blood, exsanguination, and put the corpse back on the trail. When the Hooks returned to the look for the missing man and found their bloodless comrade, every member of the patrol believed that the Aswang had got him and that one of them would be next. When daylight came, the whole Hook squadron moved out of the vicinity. And yes, this is something that I actually found out myself when I was researching my master's thesis. I was writing it on the history of a particular group of anthropologists at the turn of the century in England. And this was way before the CIA or the OSS even. And what I found out is that the reason that their whole approach to anthropology was basically written out of the history was not because of evidentiary finds in the fields. It was actually because the funding switched basically from the Carnegies and the Rockefellers to things that they considered to be of more practical use. They wanted to figure out how to use local beliefs against them. Whatever the local beliefs were of the population, they needed these sort of practical maneuvers in order to basically take the momentum of the beliefs that already existed in a certain social structure and then use that against the native population. So this has been going on well before the CIA, but is really indicative of how these elite people actually think about the world. In another section here that we find on page 12, where he discusses Hollywood as Babylon, or Hollywood Babylon, he says, Babylon was the ancient pagan empire, prominent in biblical prophetic works as an enemy of God's people due to their idolatry. Hollywood is no different, functioning as the propaganda arm of the Antichrist media establishment, intent on re-engineering society into its alchemical opposite. And by the way, you don't have to be a Christian to understand or believe this. I understand that other people have different perspectives, but essentially what he's getting at here is true. Unleashing the destructive forces of cultural Marxism and death. Now, there are a lot of people on the left who say that the concept of cultural Marxism is actually a myth or a conspiracy theory. Well, really just break it down and look at it like this. It's basically just Marxism as applied to culture. Jay actually goes into explaining this in different parts of this book, but it's not simply the haves versus the have-nots. It's an approach to be able to fractionalize all of society, to have men played off against women, the old against the young, the sick against the healthy, the black against the white, so on and so forth. It's all of the identity politics garbage that we see going on all the time today. This is just a way for the elite to keep everybody divided. As long as they're all fighting against each other, guess what they can't notice? Who's actually in control of things at the top. I continue here. This is why stories and narratives continue to emerge of Hollywood scandals, sex and murder rituals, and occult crime, with no puzzle pieces ever put together from the mindless denizens of talking head puppetdom. From the dozens of in-depth analyses on my site looking into the esoteric meanings in Hollywood films, it logically follows that this classic thesis of Hollywood Babylon is not far off. This title is not new either. Detailed accounts are found in insider research. Researchers like Peter Levenda and even older, then his Sinister Forces trilogy, which is really good, by the way, occultist Kenneth Anger's book and documentary Hollywood Babylon. I'm surprised here, too, that he didn't mention Kevin Smith, the comedian and director who has held an actual Hollywood Babylon event on multiple occasions where he's talked about these sorts of things. Of course, Kevin's approach to it is much more celebrationist, in the way that he goes about it. From its beginnings, Hollywood has been an empire of tragedies, full of lost lives, drugs, and real-life drama. But this troupe lifestyle is nothing new. The stage has long been the site of tragedy and something much darker, ritual invocation, all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. For Greece and, in debased form, Rome, the stage was sacred, where the dramaturgical interactions of the gods were actually a form of magical invocation. I would also point out here, too, that during Shakespeare's time, actors and actresses were not even allowed to testify in court during trials because they were considered to be untrustworthy sources. I think more people should probably look at actors and actresses in that way today. They are not trustworthy people to get your info from. This book, too, also has a lot of photographs, a lot of imagery taken from various famous films that he talks about. On page 14, he has a comparison set of photos from the ritualistic scenes from Roman Polanski's The Ninth Gate, also one of my favorite movies that I watch once a year, and the ritual scene from Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut. About The Ninth Gate, I don't like Roman Polanski. Obviously, he's an absolutely horrible person. Johnny Depp is as well, but he's a very good actor. The thing about this film, I think, that draws me back to it over and over is just the sort of bibliophilia that we have in it. You know, I'm a book lover, and obviously that is imbued in not only the novel that this is based on, but the film as well. But also, I think this movie is so revelatory about the occult practices that actually take place among the elite, and that's one of the reasons that Jay brings it up in his book over and over, because it is so revealing about what goes on, just like these scenes are from Eyes Wide Shut. And really the reason that I think this is the case, not only did Kubrick probably have insider knowledge about all these kinds of things, I actually think that he was quite horrified by what he saw. I think he knew all of this stuff and was terrified by it and just thought that it was, some of the worst things that anybody could ever be up to. But Roman Polanski, I think, knew it not only from an insider's perspective, but from a participant perspective. I think that he is a person who was actually involved in this kind of stuff, which is why he put so much of that in Rosemary's Baby as well. And then you have the proximity with Polanski with the Manson family murders, and of course with his lady friend, Sharon Tate, who was unfortunately probably some sort of a ritualistic sacrifice victim. And just to show that Jay doesn't just go into analyzing the film material, he also parallels it with real-world events as well. Over on page 41, we get an example of this, where he says here, for a more hardcore example of this type of revelry, author Dave McGowan recounts the details surrounding the infamous Dutroux affair, which involved human trafficking, European elites, murder in secret societies as children and women were procured for orgies and worse amongst the degenerate elite. And of course, these are the very people who set up and established the European Union and want to continue that monstrosity. And Macron has recently come out and said that he actually wants it to be an empire of its own in order to fight against the United States and China and Russia. And that is, of course, one of their ultimate sort of short, middle to long-term goals that they want to establish. But he says here, outrage continued to grow as more arrests were made and evidence of high-level government and police complicity continued to emerge. One of Dutroux's accomplices, businessman Michael Nihoul, confessed to organizing an orgy at a Belgian chateau that had been attended by government officials, a former European commissioner, and a number of law enforcement officers. A Belgian senator noted, quite accurately, that such parties were part of a system, quote, which operates to this day and is used to blackmail the highly placed people who take part. Yeah, they all have files kept on them, and the more that you go into this sort of demonic levels of evil, the more power and influence they will give you, because that gives them more and more material to hold against you and use against you at some later period if they deem that they need to do so. It continues, as the New York Times reported, Judge Jean-Marc Connereau became a national hero after saving 2 children from a secret dungeon kept by a convicted child rapist and ordering an inquiry that led to the discovery of the bodies of 4 girls kidnapped by a child pornography ring. Nihoul's parties not only involved sex, they included sadism, torture, and murder. And where else have we heard this sort of material? It reminds me of the Jimmy Savile affair from the BBC presenter who raped reportedly hundreds upon hundreds of children. The same thing with Jerry Sandusky at Penn State's football program, where he was running a child rescue mission that would put children into foster homes and up for adoption and all this sort of stuff. And then he would take advantage of these people. And he just raped dozens and dozens of boys over the years. And it was all covered up. All of this stuff was strongly, suspicious for people all around him. And nobody intervened. Nobody ever did anything about it until, dozens, possibly even hundreds of lives were ruined. I'll jump ahead here a little further to page 50, where he starts off chapter 3 talking about The Shining. He has a quote that he starts here. Down the years, he had a phrase that he repeated like a personal mantra to hold at bay anyone who pressed him too closely about the meaning of his work or his own intentions. It came from an essay by H.P. Lovecraft, like Stephen King, a popular manipulator of the occult. In all things that are mysterious, never explain. The edict applies to Kubrick's own work even more to himself. And as I was rewatching this film recently, probably the 20th viewing that I've had of it, one of the things that really jumped out about Jack Nicholson's portrayal, which was absolutely just, fantastic as the character of Jack Torrance, was It's almost as if not only was he having this awakening to this character who he had been and, had returned to the hotel multiple times in order to repeat the, devastation there. It's almost as if he's being possessed also by the hotel. Like the longer that he's there, the more it weaves its tendrils into him, because he'll have these episodes where he does something really crazy and out of line, but then, he'll fall asleep or he gets hit on the head and he comes out and he's sort of confused, like, where was I? What did I do? How did all this take place? I don't know what's going on. So really there's weird moments during this film where he almost becomes a sympathetic character because the things that are happening to him are outside and beyond his own control. I think that's just one of the sort of beautiful subtleties about the direction of it, and of course Nicholson's portrayal of the character. Another thing that really jumped out to me was how fantastic Shelley Duvall's portrayal was of his wife Wendy. I mean, she just absolutely crushed it in that film. She just came off as just amazingly played that role. Some of the other weird things that Jay points out here too is when Jack is in the lobby, when he's going for his interview and all this sort of stuff at the hotel, he's actually rather casually flipping through and I guess reading an issue of Playgirl magazine, which it says here hints towards Jack's homosexual and incestuous tendencies, because one of the main articles that is inside this particular issue of Playgirl magazine is about incest, and it says why parents sleep with their own children. This is an extremely strange and disturbing thing, and not real sure how people at the time that they went to the theater were going to be meant to pick up on something so subtle. That's something you could have caught on a VHS tape, on VCR, and of course on disc and Blu-ray and all that sort of thing now. But back then, it's a really small detail that Kubrick obviously intended to be in there, because there was absolutely never anything out of place in a Kubrick film. He thought about all this stuff usually 2, 3, sometimes even 4 years before he began to film a movie. He actually had every single part of it plotted out in advance. And if you actually happen to already have the book as you follow along while I do this, over on page 56, we have a really interesting thing here where he has a photograph, of an image from the film where it shows the twin little girls who were actually murdered by Grady. And it says here, the Bull Minotaur Taurus symbol with Gemini, the twins, and Monarch. So over on a poster to the left, the upper left from their head, it says Monarch. This is a reference to Project Monarch, which is also referenced in Netflix's show Stranger Things. But above the twin girls is another poster that has a bull towering over them, basically being the Minotaur or beast symbol that represents Jack Torrance's character. But above that, too, also not mentioned for some reason, is that there is an exit sign. And this is a representation to me, that little Danny's path is blocked as of yet. He is not going to be able to escape this place until a later point, if he's able to get lucky enough to get away from the beast. Over on the next page, 57, we have another interesting series of sentences here where he says, Danny is spoken of as lost, signifying both a literal and figurative sense, looking for his parents. He has been abandoned, his parents' fixation on the landscape leaving him forgotten in the, quote, game room. Jack rhetorically comments on Danny's playfulness. Did you get tired of bombing the universe? Signifying Danny's representation of youthful American aggression, the great Enlightenment experiment that sits upon a giant Indian burial ground, meaning the United States itself. Also, too, I would say that I think, really one of the ways that I watch the film is that Jack has a certain jealousy of Danny and Danny's emergent power. And one of the things I think that's happening with the evil that is basically taking over Jack's character is trying to drive him to destroy Danny before he realizes the fullness of his power. Because the hotel, through its intermediaries, does tell Jack that Danny is a threat to him and to the hotel, the entities at the hotel. And that threat would, of course, be bringing in an outsider who would interfere with things. And over on page 60, we have a couple of other really important notes here, because he jumps back to the issue of Twilight language that is brought up by Michael A. Hoffman. He says, Twilight language is a form of angelic script that integrates synchronistic events, like a kind of semiotic text to be read while writers and directors like King, Kubrick, and Steven Spielberg are operating in the role of the magus to produce a dramaturgical ritual that communicates with the subconscious. And lower down here on the same page, he goes on to say, simulacra is important to semiotics, but it is also an important role in esotericism because of the idea of correspondences. And I'll point out here that simulacra appears also in The Matrix. Neo actually holds the book by Jean Baudrillard called Simulacra and Simulation, and Morpheus quotes that later on when he says, "Welcome to the desert of the real." And I would point out here too that whenever you're dealing with semiotics and simulacra, you're also ultimately talking about various philosophers such as Lyotard and Derrida, the post-structuralists, and postmodernism in general. But he says, before modern philosophy divorced metaphysics from academia, the holistic view of the sciences in the Western tradition included an idea of essentialism, which connected the essences of things with all of their reference and symbols. And I wrote it here to the side, a really big yes. This is one of the things that people don't understand about language. So many people have disconnected language today from its references to actual things in the material world. But the worldview back then, during the ancient world, of course, during the Middle Ages, and then through the Renaissance, they thought that there was a direct correspondence between words and things. And one of the things that they always try to do was to get back to the original language, as close as they could anyway, to the original language of God, which was the way that God had spoken all things into existence, or also a dual reference to the way that Adam named all things in God's creation. And this is why they had all of these beliefs about the Jewish Kabbalah and the Christian Kabbalah, which I made references to before when I covered the Voynich manuscript and the Devil's Bible, or the Codex Gigas. Over on page 76 here, we have chapter 4, where he gets into 2001: A Space Odyssey. And this part he calls an alchemical spatial odyssey. And that is because one of the things about the elite is they appeal to this notion. Really what they want to bring about is an alchemical transmutation of the species. They want to have this sort of ultimate melding of man and machine. They want us to be able to basically upload our brains so that we can live forever, or at least so that the elite can live forever. I'm sure not us, the hoi polloi, the lowly nobodies. They don't want us to live forever. They want us to have these short, regulated lives and whatnot. They want to be able to socially engineer us and control us and manipulate us and all that sort of stuff, but they want to be able to upload their brains or their minds into a supercomputer so that they can go on and on with the artificial intelligence, basically the sort of God that they'll ultimately end up worshiping. Over on pages 82 and 83, Jay also has some important things to point out here as he starts to talk about rationalism and atheism, basically. And he says here, there are only two possibilities here, and once we consider this basic philosophical question, we can extrapolate Darwinism as clearly a manifestation of the second. Though most Darwinian adherents would be at pains to insist there is no ultimate guiding principle, the worldview still tends towards the notion of forces of nature determining. This determination, however, is ultimately irrational and impersonal, aside from the appearance of order, telos, and design. So yeah, it's not at all something that is in-state directed. If you want to understand more about that particular conception of things, get Stephen Jay Gould's book, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory. It's a massive tome, about 800 pages, where he sets out this, mechanistic, materialistic worldview. He says here, but there are many, many more problems with positing ultimate reality or the absolute as an impersonal force. If ultimate reality is impersonal and chaotic, then all localized events, phenomena, and objects are also devoid of any ultimate meaning. And of course, that also means our own lives and our interactions with one another are ultimately empty and meaningless and purposeless. This is basically what Nietzsche was driving at. You always have these Christians who get all bent out of shape. They'll say, Nietzsche said that God is dead, but God laughs or whatever, and he says Nietzsche is dead. But really, if you pay attention to what Nietzsche's saying there, is he actually puts those words into the mouth of a madman. He says the madman comes up to people in the streets and he says, God is dead, we have killed him, you and me. And he's basically talking about the people with the Enlightenment mentality, this modernist mentality, the rationalists and the secularists and whatnot. Lovecraft was a person too who actually, got this conceptualization. What he he said that there was a source of great terror in this idea, that there is no God and everything is just basically a mechanistic, materialistic universe. He said that, the ultimate realization from that is that there is no morality whatsoever that is not some kind of an artificial construct of man. And this is why so many people, you'll find them turning to utilitarianism and consequentialism as a result. They try to figure out some kind of a way to ground morality, and basically those are the only things they can come up with, unless they go into some sort of virtue ethics or, some kind of personal reflections of like, well, my belief about the world is X, Y, and Z, and then they try to get ethics from that. But I'm actually working on a book about ethics, and I'm hoping that'll be ready in January or February. I don't know. It's taking a lot longer than I expected. Over on page 84 and 85, we also find some interesting things. He says here, as for the relevance to the film, the mistake many make is to place Kubrick's work in a purely scientific scheme of rationalistic natural process, when the presentation is far more occult, where it is the planetary gods who are leading man through his planetary ascent to apotheosis through technology. And really what he's getting at there is basically these people project their own secularist or atheistic presuppositions onto the film, and that causes them to have these massive incorrect interpretations. And over on the next page, he says here, the doctrine of eternal return is the classical Western perspective, meaning the pre-Christian classical Western perspective. The history is cyclical and destined to repeat its events with fatalistic certainty. And there's a reference to this also in season 1 of True Detective, probably one of the maybe the best single standalone season of any television show that I've ever seen, where Rust Cole's character says time is a flat circle. And he talks about how, basically we're all doomed to relive the horrors of this world just over and over and over again, but ultimately at the end of the show, he breaks through that perspective and he starts to see the positivity in the light. And although I have barely even scratched the surface of this fantastic book, I can see that this episode is getting a little bit long, so I probably need to be drawing it to a close. And really, I could just go on about this stuff for hours and hours on end because I absolutely love it. I think it's just fantastic. This is one of the best books, probably quite possibly the best book I have read this year. And I read hundreds of books per year, mind you. So by way of conclusion, I would just say everyone should, order this book. I'll link all of the material and info below so that you can check out Jay's site. Maybe you can order an autographed copy. I understand that he sells those from his own website. Also, I'll link Amazon and all of that so you can check it out there. I really look forward to getting the second volume of this. He has recently published a volume 2 of Esoteric Hollywood, and I don't know what the contents are of that one. I have no idea what films he looks into there, but I absolutely can't wait to get to that. I would also like to do a review of that if possible. But everything in my life and my family's life gets really busy at this time of year, so that may be, late January or February before I'm able to get around to that. But absolutely, everybody go out and get Jay Dyer's Esoteric Hollywood. It is fantastic. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.